Tonight's presentation is by Dr. Marie Duggan from the program in economics and soon to be with the program of business management here at Keene State. Professor Duggan has been at Keene State since the fall of 2000. She's got a PhD and an MA from the New School for Social Research in New York and a BA from Tufts University down the road in Boston. Her fields of teaching include international finance, deindustrialization, macroeconomics, as well as introductory and senior level courses in management like business and society. Her research is diverse and reflective of, among other things, the places where she lives. It's one of the things I'm really interested in how she finds her topics. She's looked extensively at the history of business and economic development in Keene and Greater New England. She's also written a great deal about the early economic history of her home state of California, including books and articles on the region's native and mission economies. Her talk tonight is a continuation of that theme. It's got a changed title, and I've forgotten what the specifics of it are, so she'll present that to you. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Duggan and give her the screen. I'll return at the end of the talk to help with questions and to close us out. So welcome, Marie Duggan.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike, and thanks for organizing this seminar series, which I have really enjoyed. And thank you all for coming after a long Wednesday. It is a pleasure to tell you about the work that I do. So, as Mike was saying, I've been in the economics department and I'm moving to management. And this paper is kind of an intersection of those two. It's about how Mexican silver magnates financed missions in California around the year 1700. And I know that I changed that title, which was perhaps not polite, but the thing is that this is very much research that I'm heavily involved in right now. And the project developed a lot in the past month. And so that is one thing, that it is breaking research. It's not completely finished yet. And it's also research about contraband trade. And that means that that's not, when you research contraband trade, it would be great to have a lot of data, but you never have a complete data set when you're working with contraband trade. And yet, in Latin America, some people say the contraband trade was 90% of the total trade. So it'd be really inappropriate to overlook it. So let me pop into the next one. And I'd also like to say that it'd be great if you post questions and comments, because I do think that's the best part. So for this project, what I'm doing is I'm looking at the development, of California from the perspective of, okay, I cannot move your faces. I'll just live with that. So I'm looking at California from the South and from long ago. And as Mike was saying, I do write a lot about California, as I also write about New England. But usually I'm talking about California, the part that we know, where the Spanish arrived in 1769. But today I'm going to look at California from Mexico around 1700. And at that time, they would talk about this entire area from Cape Mendocino to Los Cabos as being California. It was just one thing. Sometimes they called it Las Californias, but it wasn't really, it didn't have this border. The whole thing belonged to Spain. And not very many Spaniards went there, but a few did every year in the Manila Galleon. So it was Cabo Mendocino to Cabo San Lucas, and Cape Mendocino was actually named in the 16th century. And the only port in Spain's northern Pacific Rim was Acapulco down here. So Acapulco is going to be important to the story. And the other thing that's important to the story is the Gulf of California, which is this body of water here between Baja California Sur and mainland Mexico, which was called New Spain at the time, right? We had New England starting in 1621. We had New Spain starting in 1521. So when I come into the story, 1670, the Spanish have been there for about 150 years. And if you think about it, in New England, settlers came in 1621, and by 1776, which is like 150 years later, they were fighting for independence. So the Spanish came to New Spain in 1521, and by 1670, the business class has become pretty independent from Spain, especially in the Pacific. So this was the route of the Manila galleon trade, which was a really important route in world history. And for our purposes, to anybody in 1700 in New Spain, the important thing about California is that it was on this route. So the Manila galleon sailed from Acapulco to Manila. You see how Manila is pretty much opposite California. And the Manila galleon carried silver and sold that in China, because China is where the world paid the highest price for silver. Actually, the Spanish unloaded in Manila, and there was a group of Spanish-speaking Chinese called the Sangles who lived in Manila, and they would actually buy the silver and get it to China. And then the merchants on the galleon from New Spain would buy with their profits cloth. So that would be Chinese silks and also cotton from India. And they would sail to come home. They would sail north past Japan and then catch a current that brought them close to Cape Mendocino. When they noticed that the seaweed was changing, that's how they knew to turn south. They would pass Monterey and sail through the Santa Barbara Channel, then by Los Cabos, and then across to the mainland and down to Acapulco. So at that time, so California was really on this major trading route. And a lot of people who study California history, when we think of modern California, they say that there were no commercial actors in the Hispanic period, and the first commercial actors came from New England around 1796. And one of the things I found out is how really inappropriate that is. The wealthiest man in Mexico sailed through the Santa Barbara Channel in 1700 as the captain of the galleon, which was entirely a mercantile endeavor. It was a very dangerous passage. It could take from 4 to 8 months. And the only reason people took that trip is because you could make a fortune. And every member of the crew was a person who had some cargo to sell on their own account. So it was really a very mercantile endeavor. So my question was, why did private merchants finance Jesuit settlement of Las Californias and the time that they did? So in 1670, the Spanish crown tried to settle Baja California in a joint endeavor with the Jesuits. But the whole thing really fell apart very quickly, and the crown lost 225,000 pesos and gave up. So by 1697, the Jesuits were working with private merchants, and they had created the Pious Fund for the Californias, which is also known in Spanish as the Fondo Pío, which was an endowment to finance missions, and through that, the settlement of California. And really, I think they did intend to go as far north as Monterey or San Francisco, but they didn't get that far. They really just settled Baja California. The Jesuits did. Later things changed, but my story is really just about the Jesuits. So the Pious Fund was an endowment, which wound up with about 500,000 in capital, which was in land and cash. And it's still true today that when people are raising an endowment, there's sort of a 5% rule, which is that you can count on spending about 5% of the capital that you raise. So when a merchant donated 10,000 pesos to the Pious Fund, that meant the Jesuits would have $500 that they could use to found a mission. So they would pay the Jesuit who worked at the mission in Baja California $500. And that's because a $10,000 donation could earn 5% interest when it was invested in something. And the missionaries were really quite dedicated people. One of the leader was initially Juan Maria Salvatierra, and he lived for decades among the indigenous peoples of Baja California. We today probably think that the Baja California people would have been better if the Jesuits never came, and that's probably true. But certainly Salvatierra was an idealist. He thought he was doing the right thing. He lived very frugally. The Jesuits who went out there would live there for decades, and they worked really hard to persuade Indians to give up hunting and gathering and adopt agriculture. Agriculture didn't work very well because Baja California is extraordinarily dry, despite the picture. So maybe the picture was a little idealized. So they were what they said they were. They were very ascetic people. And so my question was, why did the wealthiest merchants of the time donate money to the Jesuit endeavor to settle Baja California? And well, a great many books have been written about Baja California. You think this is an obscure topic, but actually all the Jesuits who went there were really educated people, and they all wrote a book about their time 30 years out in the dry desert. And many people since then have written about it, but very few people have asked who were the merchants and why did they make these donations. So when people do ask that question, the conventional wisdom is that they were looking for a safe haven for the galleon in Baja California, that they wanted a port. This is a picture of a small British ship attacking the galleon, which was a huge ship. Okay, the galleon was a huge ship. The galleon makes me think of the Ever Given stuck in the Suez, because like the Ever Given, the galleon was stuffed to the gills. It was way overloaded with merchandise. And so it was a very slow moving ship. And in addition, after the crew had been on board for 4 to 8 months, when they got to Los Cabos, they were suffering from scurvy or beriberi, and these things make these illnesses make it so you cannot move very well. They're kind of paralyzing. So much smaller ships filled with 50 healthy people could take the galleon, even though it had 250 crew, and it was difficult for the ship to maneuver. So there was this thought that a safe haven port at Los Cabos or somewhere else in Baja would be good. In fact, they thought about establishing a safe haven port at what is now San Diego as early as 1719. And that was because Spain and Britain were at war between 1701 and 1714. And whenever two nations were at war, it became legal for pirates to seize the ships. So between 1701 and 1714, it was legal for pirates to seize the galleon. And this is a really interesting comment from a pirate named Dampier, who was casing the joint in 1697. So in 1697, it was not legal for him to seize a galleon because Spain and Britain were not at war and he was British. This is what he wrote. He wrote, "The galleon falls in first with the coast of California and then coasts along the shore to the south and never whizzes a wind to bring her away from thence quite to Acapulco. When she gets the length of Cape San Lucas, which is the southernmost point of California, she stretches over to Cape Corrientes." So here's Cape Corrientes. It's this spot between these three islands and the shore, which is about the 20th degree of north latitude. And the 20th degree is this line here. From thence she coasts along until she comes to Sayagua, and there she sets ashore passengers that are bound to the city of Mexico. And then she finally gets to Acapulco, where she unloads, and she arrives about Christmas, never more than 8 or 10 days after. So he had made these detailed observations so he could sit in an island, perhaps the Tres Marias, and attack. And often the attack was here, and then it could also be here. So I wanted to show this to you for other reasons too. I want you to see the Gulf of California here. And I do think that this whole area is going to turn out to be really critical, but I don't think that the reason the wealthy financed the Jesuit settlements in Baja was just to prevent piracy. And also, while we're going, I would like to also mention that my sister, Kathleen Harper, is a geologist, and she has helped me find these historical maps, which I find really fun. Okay, so the thing is that piracy was only a problem between 1701 and 1714, because that is when Britain and Spain were at war. So outside of that time period, it wasn't legal for the British or Dutch to seize a galleon, and they usually didn't. If the countries were not at war, they did not seize the galleon. So the donations for settling Baja emerged between 1670 and 1700, and the big donations continued until 1741. So then I have to look for other commercial motives to see why would merchants donate in the earlier period. And I have a friend in Mexico City, Guillermina del Valle Pavon, and she writes about the reorganization of silver mining, 1670 to 1740. And you know what really struck me is that that time period exactly coincides with the rise of the Fondo Pio to settle California. So I started to realize that, well, I came up with this hypothesis, were silver miners seeking control of the Gulf of California so that they could secretly export untaxed silver out of Mexico to China on the galleon. And that is sort of my working hypothesis, that they were doing that. But so then I had to go find some evidence for this. So the piece of coast we were just looking at, where the islands, the Tres Marias, are right here, and Cabo San Lucas is right over here, and the Gulf of California is right here. This is Nayarit. So Nayarit has the little ports, and this is Zacatecas. And this whole image here is called New Galicia, and New Galicia was a piece of New Spain. Zacatecas is where the silver mines were. Zacatecas is still today known as one of the great silver mining districts of human history. And when the silver was harvested or mined, it was sent down here to Guadalajara. Now, you could then turn this direction and go to Mexico City, which is what they were supposed to do. But it was also possible to turn this direction and send the silver to Tepic, and then export it into the Pacific, basically evading taxes. And one of the things you had in Nayarit after the Jesuits began to settle Baja California is a port called Matanchel, which was used by the Jesuits for supplying Baja California. So this is another image that shows you the route for possibly smuggling raw untaxed silver out of the mines. This is Cadereyta, came up in the documents. It's around modern Monterrey, and here's Zacatecas. And if you keep going down, you come to Guadalajara, and then you turn, you get up to Matanchel. Now, next to Guadalajara, you might not be able to see this because of the zoom thing, but there's a place called Cuisillos. And it turned out that Cuisillos was the largest ranch in New Galicia, and it was owned by Luis Sanchez de Tagle, who was the wealthiest man in Mexico from 1690 to 1710. And how did he get his money? So Luis Sanchez de Tagle, it's the name you're supposed to remember here. So the silver had value, in part because the Chinese were willing to pay double what Europeans were for silver. And from 1570 to 1625, the Chinese paid so much for silver that almost all the silver produced in Mexico wound up in China. That is, half of it was shipped to Spain, but the Spanish bought things from the Dutch and the English took it to China. And half of it was really sent out of the Pacific on the galleon to China. So what happened is so much silver was shipped to China that by the middle of the 17th century, which would be like 1650, 1665, the world price of silver had fallen so the supply and demand relationship in China for silver had changed, and silver had fallen in price. And as a result, miners of silver in Zacatecas and Cadereyta started to really be strapped for cash. Now, the Spanish crown had a policy of charging miners 20%. So you had to pay a fifth of what of your silver, you had to pay it to the Spanish crown. And as long as the Chinese were paying a very high price for silver, that really wasn't a problem. But it became a big problem after 1660. And so for a while, there was the mine started to close, people went bankrupt. And then Luis Sanchez de Tagle comes along, and he starts to lend miners money. And mining is kind of like farming. You have to have an advance first. You know how when you farm, you have to buy the seeds, often on credit, and then, months later, you have the harvest and you can pay back for the seeds. So mining is like that because silver can only be refined with the help of mercury. So miners would have to buy the mercury before they mined, and then they would get silver, hopefully, and pay the crown back. It was the crown that originally, the Spanish crown would lend the miners the mercury or sell it to them. It would lend them the money to buy mercury, and it would sell them mercury at a low price. But after all these miners went bankrupt, the crown didn't want to lend them any more money. And so Luis Sanchez de Tagle comes along, and he, as a private merchant, begins to lend the miners money to purchase mercury. So why was it profitable for Luis Sanchez de Tagle to lend money to miners where it wasn't profitable for the crown? And the answer is that Luis Sanchez de Tagle didn't pay the Spanish crown the 20% tax. And he collected silver from the miners in its raw state. I think it had been refined, but it was not yet turned into gold bars and stamped. And so he would take that. Now, I read this book written in 1971, and it says, well, everybody paid the tax because there was really no way to spend untaxed silver, because you had to wait for it to be turned into silver bars and stamped. But actually, that's not true. What Luis Sanchez de Tagle figured out is that he just had to spend the untaxed silver that didn't have the royal stamp. He had to spend it outside of New Spain. He had to get it to China. And so that's what he did. So his debtors paid him in the raw untaxed silver. And my theory is that he then took it down to Guadalajara and exported it through Tepic.
Hello?
So my colleagues have figured out that he was paid in raw untaxed silver. It's my theory that he got the raw untaxed silver out of the country.
I heard somebody.
Sorry, just cleaning.
No problem.
On this route. Oops. Okay, so if I want to prove my theory, there's a couple different steps. And I can't really prove it, but I can explore it and explain why I think it holds water. The first question I had, so really what I'm thinking is that this was the Jesuit port. So the donors financed the Jesuits, which included providing them with boats so they could ship materials to Baja California. And my theory is that the silver miners did that because they wanted to use the boats to take raw untaxed silver and slip it onto the galleon somehow in a way that they could get away with, to ship it to China. So the first question for supporting that hypothesis would be, were the donors actually silver miners? And you would think that this was a really obvious thing given these quite a few books written on the topic of Baja California, but actually very few people were interested in how the donors made their money. And also, it's not common for the donors to really talk about that. If you were a silver miner, I don't know, when you read about the gold rush in California in 1848, lots of people write the story of their life and how they got rich, and they're proud of it. But people who went to New Spain didn't write about it too much. So the first donor was Alonso Dávalos y Bracamonte, and he was born in Compostela, Spain. And when he got to New Spain, he married the heiress of a silver mine called Espiritu Santo, which I found is still being explored by, modern corporations. And he lived in a place called Compostela, New Galicia. So there was a Compostela in Spain and a Compostela in New Spain. And people said there was so much silver in Espiritu Santo that mules were loaded with silver from Mexico City in the same way that a modern pack train might carry fish. Okay, so that was a good sign that my theory holds a little water, because there's one donor who really definitely was connected to silver. Another donor, okay, this is a picture of where they're from in Spain. So almost all the donors are from here, which is Cantabria on the very north coast of Spain. And the Cantabrians were the leading merchants. Luis Sanchez de Tagle was from Cantabria. Dávalos Bracamonte was actually from Compostela, which is actually kind of unique, but you can see it's actually not that far from Cantabria. So another donor was Maria Rosa de la Peña. She donated a lot. So Dávalos y Bracamonte didn't donate a lot. He just donated first, which was kind of important. But she donated a lot. And it turned out that she was married to Pedro Tagle Villegas. So the fact that she's got the Tagle name implies some sort of connection to Luis Sanchez de Tagle. I mean, it implies a kinship connection. And I have not been able to verify that they were kin, but I think they were. And I did find some business ties. And through the way she had a business tie was she held the power of attorney for a man who refined silver in Monterrey named Antonio Lopez Villegas, who must have been a relative of her husband, Pedro Tagle Villegas. Anyway, when he died in 1721, he said in his will that he had done business all his life with Luis Sanchez de Tagle. And he also said that he was from this tiny town in Cantabria called Santianas del Mar, which is also the hometown of Luis Sanchez de Tagle. So this was kind of good evidence that the donors to the Fondo Pio to settle Baja California were connected to the wealthiest man in Mexico of the day and deeply involved in silver. But it turns out that the donation that was truly the linchpin donation came from the treasurer of the Manila Galleon in Acapulco named Pedro Gil. Okay, you see Pedro Gil, but you say Pedro Gil in Spanish. So he donated the ship Santa Elvira, and he also donated the crew, which included his cousin, who would be the captain of the ship. And I thought this really did a lot for my theory that you could carry silver out of the Gulf of California over to Acapulco and get it on the galleon. Because of course, if Pedro Gil was the treasurer at Acapulco, he would know exactly how to smuggle untaxed silver onto the galleon. And furthermore, he had his own crew on the boat. So he donated the ship so that it could bring supplies to the Jesuits in Baja California. But I'm thinking that it was used for that, but it might also have been used to carry silver onto the galleon. And I just want to go back for a minute and show you again this one. So the first donor he lived in Compostela. Now for me, that's right behind, sort of behind here. And the business, or maybe it's a little bit lower, like right here. And the business town was Tepic, and well, no, I guess we're a little bit lower. Tepic's a little bit lower, but the port that the Jesuits used was somewhere around here. So the ships were supposed to go up here to Loreto, which was the main Jesuit center in Baja. And they did do that, but my guess is that they also went down to Acapulco. And there is a really interesting thing that the ships that were supposed to bring supplies to Baja California people expected them to take a month, but they often took 4 months. So I'm kind of wondering if that's because they slipped down to Acapulco and came back again. And it was a hardship for the Jesuits in Baja that the supplies arrived with a delay. But of course, what they said at the time is that the delay was just because of weather. And I can't prove that that was not true. So, oh, okay, here, I actually already had a little map. So this is what the Santa Elvira was supposed to do, going from Montanchel up to Loreto. And my guess is they went down to Acapulco as well, but it's just a theory. So another big donor was Jose de la Puente y Peña. And he was Maria Rosa de la Peña's brother-in-law and her cousin, because these Cantabrian financiers of the silver trade had a habit of a person is born in Cantabria in Spain, a young man, he comes over at about 13, and then later he marries, so he apprentices with a merchant, and then he marries the merchant's daughter when he's old enough. So the merchant with whom he apprentices was usually his uncle. So when he married the merchant's daughter, he was marrying his cousin. So then the elder merchant would train his nephew, and his nephew would become his son-in-law. So you see that over and over again. And I suppose that this was a very good way to keep money inside the family, but also to keep information inside the family. And if your whole business relies on tax evasion, it would really have helped to have a very tight-knit community. So they donated 50,000 pesos around 719 to found a whole cluster of missions in Baja California Sur, including the one at Los Cabos, which is called San Jose del Cabo. And that was the one that really mattered to Jose de la Puente. And it's actually named after him. So he's Jose, and that's why it's San Jose del Cabo. They say that, I didn't just make that up. And he insisted that it be founded at the Bay of San Bernabe, which was a bay that was deep enough where the galleon could anchor. And the galleon did stop there every year after 1734. Now, so he makes the donation in 1719, but the mission isn't actually founded until 1732 because this tip of Baja California was inhabited by a lot of runaway pirates. So it was not simply indigenous people. Jesuits knew how to convert indigenous people, how to pressure them to become sedentary, but the Jesuits were afraid to settle at these missions in the tip of Baja California because these were not indigenous people. Some people said they were white, just like the Dutch and the English, and other people said they were black, just like the sailors from Lima. It was clearly a community of kind of outlaws who lived down there and who would be able to fight back. But the donor really insisted, and in fact, several Jesuits were killed trying to establish missions down here. So one of the things I want to point out is that 1719 was the date of the major donation and the decision that the donor wants a mission there. And that's what's sort of important in my mind for his decision for donating, is that he made the donation in 1719. So I do think that this, the first thing I thought of, well, then maybe they were trying to stop pirates after all, because the big attacks by pirates were 1704, 1709, and 1714. So you could say, well, he's asking for a safe haven in 1719, because of the memories of the galleon being attacked. But I don't think that was it, because peace was made between Spain and England in 1714. So that meant that piracy was no longer a threat. And what I found in the business literature was that the Crown had decreed in 1718 that no more textiles from China were to be imported from New Spain on the galleon. So I had already found out that Jose de la Puente was connected to silver. And I didn't mention this before, but people said that his he was a very wealthy man, and they said that his wealth originated at a silver shop in Mexico City, and that he owned many silver and gold mines. And it was his sister, Maria Rosa de la Peña, who had the connections in Monterrey. But as you know, when I saw this date, I started to think that maybe what was more important for Jose de la Peña was finding a way to get, you know, if you're a silver merchant that exports to China, you export the silver to China, make your money, and then invest it in products from Asia, which would have been mainly textiles at that time. And then you would bring that back to New Spain to try to make a second profit. So I started to think that actually for him, the more important thing was the textiles. Now, this is a really interesting map. It shows all the places that De La Puente had donated money to Jesuits. So it turns out he didn't just donate to Baja California. He was a very wealthy man, and he donated to a lot of places. And what I found really interesting here is that he had donated so much in India, and India was the source for cotton cloth in you know, from 1670 to 1700. This was in 1730. This was where cotton came from. We now think of cotton as coming from Manchester, England, or Manchester, New Hampshire, but it originally wasn't made there. It was made in India for hundreds of years. If you wanted cotton cloth, you got it from India. Even bandanas actually came from India. They called bandanas paliacates at this time, and paliacate is a place in India, sort of right around this, and they made at that time squares of cotton cloth with a paisley print on it, which is basically what a bandana is. So he was, when I see this, he's got an outpost in the Philippines where he's donated money. He's donated money in Macau, which was the Portuguese trading post in China. And he's got all these spots in India and one down here. So what I'm basically thinking is that he was a textile merchant that donated in the places where he had business, and that he was importing cotton cloth to the Philippines, importing Chinese cloth from Macau, and then getting it to New Spain. And that the decree in 1718 that it was forbidden to import textiles into Mexico from Asia was really devastating for him. And that he really wanted that mission at Los Cabos because he could use the Bay of San Barnabé as a place to offload the galleon. So he would overstuff the galleon in Manila with, you know, after the galleon left, you see the galleon, it would leave from a place here, and then it has to travel down here before it heads to the Pacific. And there were all kinds of little spots where you could put extra bales of basically textiles onto the galleon before sailing for New Spain. And in fact, there's actually a record from 1726 of a heel, a tagle and a heel were captured overloading a galleon, which then was wrecked because it was too heavy, and the first storm that came up, it was wrecked. So I think that's probably what he was involved with, but I have no evidence of that. All I have is this map showing all the places where he donated to Jesuits. But when I see it, it just makes me think, oh, he must have been a textile importer. And of course, you know, maybe I can find some more data later. What the data does tell me is that he made money through silver, and he had silver and gold mines. So this is the mission San Jose del Cabo, which is in Los Cabos. It used to be right next to the Bay of San Barnabé. Then it got moved later, like a couple miles away. But I know some of you have probably been to Los Cabos. Maybe you'll see it sometime. So my thesis was that the donors gave to the Fondo Pio de las Californias because they wanted to control the Gulf of California in order to export untaxed silver to Asia. And I did find evidence that the donors were connected to the silver trade, and also that they were connected to the Gulf of California. You know, that early donor lived in Compostela. And I didn't mention this, but also I found that Maria Rosa de la Peña, she had sold a slave in 1696 in Tepic, which is another little town on the Gulf of California. So that was just interesting to me that she was doing business in Tepic. And of course, the fact that she was selling a slave reinforces that all these people are 1%ers. You know, they are really the very wealthy of their day. And, you know, this isn't a story about the men of the people. I doubt the people who worked in their silver mines were treated too well either. And then I also found that the treasurer of the port of Acapulco gave a ship and a crew captained by his cousin, which would have made, loading contraband onto the galleon quite feasible. But the surprise was that Jose de la Peña may have been, that there are these little hints that he was a textile merchant from Asia. And this kind of forced me to pay a little bit more attention to the Asia side of commerce in 1700. I thought this was the story about looking at California from the perspective of New Spain, or from Mexico looking up. And it also was a story about looking at California really from Asia, which that keeps coming back to me. And it keeps surprising me how global trade was at the time. So then I also wanted to point out like some of the bigger ideas that come to me while I'm working on this project. So everybody, of course, asked me, why, Marie, do you spend all your time reading about silver merchants in obscure Spanish documents? And I am pretty fascinated by it. And basically, one of the things that interests me is the relationship between for-profit donors and not-for-profit idealists. And of course, I work at an institution that has an endowment, and I think it's really important for us to raise funds for our endowment. And in one sense, I have nothing to do with the endowment. I'm just a person, right, who is motivated by entirely other things. So, but the institution can't really exist unless people do give to the institution. So that makes me kind of interested in that topic. And then I'm also really interested in the relationship between New Spain and Spain. So it was a very elaborate scheme, if I'm right, that the silver merchants had to evade paying taxes to the crown. The silver merchants in Spain, in New Spain, were evading paying taxes to the crown. And it does help me to think about the comparison to New England 150 years later, where the business class in New England in 1776 broke free from England. And in New Spain, the business class did not have a political revolution, but they did really begin to act on their own and to control really important posts, such as the treasurer at the port of Acapulco. And it turned out later that the governor of the Philippines was also a tagle, and the captain of the Manila galleon was often a tagle. So they were really almost creating a separate, hidden bureaucracy that was independent from Spain. And yet, whenever the Spanish crown was in trouble, they would donate money. If there was an emergency, they would donate money. And they also purchased aristocratic titles from the crown. And some people say, well, the crown didn't collect taxes, but it collected money by selling these aristocratic titles. So anyway, I think about that, like, is it really right to call this contraband if there was so much of it? Or is this really like a kind of a way of becoming independent without completely breaking from the imperial center? And then the other thing that comes up is that the whole question of, were Manila and California more colonies of the Mexico City business class than they were of the crown? And this first came to me when I read this book by a fellow named Bonialian. And Bonialian said that Manila was a colony of Mexico City and not really a colony of Spain. And I was like, wow, well, if that's true, then California was also a colony of Mexico City and not really a colony of Spain. And that's really what stimulated me to start doing this research. I met Bonialian and I told him, well, you should look at Baja. And he said, well, I don't have time, you do that. So then I had to like go through and see, who were these businessmen who financed the settlement of Baja California by the Jesuits. And then the other thing is, the way these strategic business decisions are made was filled with relationships of loyalty and trust that were very personal. And in the modern world, a lot of business is done in a very impersonal way. But I have this other project where we research the business community in Keene itself. And here in Keene, there is a long history of very personal business leaders who knew the working people and knew their competitors and knew the whole area. And I think one of the things that struck me is if the Jesuits, if the donors financed the Jesuits, they would have had a real loyalty with the Jesuits. And in later years, when the galleon came, the Jesuits did look out for it, and they did try to bring food to the crew. And the idea of Jose de la Puente y Peña donating to Jesuit enterprises at every place where he was doing business means that he was also establishing relationships of loyalty with every place that he did business. And I find that kind of appealing. So that's where I will stop. Thank you.
I always forget to unmute at this point, and I start talking and saying what a nice, very provocative and interesting talk that was. And I realize I'm saying that to myself. So I stopped and wanted to let you know, Marie, that was, as usual, eye-opening, sort of some of the things that you got me thinking about. The Jesuits, I actually feel a little bit sorry for them and their role, and the Indians on the Baja Peninsula also, and also just sort of the provocative idea that who's a colony of who? Is Spain colonizing Manila, or is Mexico City? This is all really interesting stuff, and I have a couple of questions, but there are some that are already up there, and so I want to go to those and start with one from Wes Martin. And Wes, if you're around, you can jump in and sort of verbalize it too. But the question he has in the chat is, did the peace between Spain and England only end legalized piracy, in which privateers were the letters of Manc and transformed into legal pirates? Or do we have any evidence that concerned illegal piracy that could have threatened Spanish shipments despite the peace between Spain and England? Can you talk a little bit about that, Marie?
Well, that is a very good question. And I have actually wondered that myself, because especially with that quote from William Dampier, where he's casing the joint in 1697. And I mean, maybe people at the time had a sense that war was going to break out between Spain and England. He did come and try to take a galleon in 1704, but he did wait until it was legal. So actually, when I looked at the history, it really seemed to be that it was mainly during wartime. And I guess I was looking specifically at Baja California, that there was another war in the late 1500s, like 1597 to 1602. And again, there was piracy. And that's when one of the merchants was Sebastian Vizcaíno. And he financed exploration of the California that I know, up north of the San Francisco Bay, because he was trying to figure out a way to stop that. So at least with regard to Baja California, it definitely seemed that the threat was more important during the war. Like Sebastian Vizcaíno actually suggested that the crown settle Monterey, but since the war was over, they just didn't bother with that. So, but I think, Wes, that I will keep probing and see if there's more to it.
Okay. Wes has a second question, but at first I want to jump to sort of a comment by Tammy Warner, one of your colleagues, and she says that you're talking about the Dutch disease, which is a reference I'm not familiar with, but she mentions that resource economics drives so much of history, and I wonder if you could sort of see how, or comment on how this fits into sort of how resource economics is underneath a lot of what we considered on the surface just to be the way history is unfolding.
Well, the Dutch disease, as I understand it, it's an economics term, and Tammy's an economist, as I am. So the Dutch disease is this idea that you're so blessed to find silver in your country, and yet then it becomes the only thing that your economy revolves around. And so if there is a drop in the price of silver, the whole thing is in trouble. And you see that with Saudi Arabia today, where you could say, wow, they are so lucky to have oil wells, but then the country has had a hard time diversifying away from oil and is highly dependent on that. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have the answer for the resource economics. I think what I tend to focus on more is the people.
Sure.
So one of the stories that kind of struck me is that it turns out you don't actually need mercury to refine every bit of silver in New Spain. It's actually possible to pick up silver and melt it in a backyard burner. That makes me think of maple syrup. But the Indians were the ones who picked up silver and melted it in the backyard burner, and they had to pay a 20% tax and could not really practice tax evasion. So that's sort of the thing that that I noticed more. I guess I'm going to say I'm not the greatest resource economist, even though that is the trendy thing. Maybe
Sure.
I should be.
Well, thanks. A sort of a tag on to Wes's question from before, and that is that, you know, if we're looking to sort of maximize profit and we're silver magnates, wouldn't it have been more economically efficient for them to fund the naval force to end piracy than setting up all the settlements that provided the excuse for the Jesuit presence that allowed for the smuggling of the silver?
You know, that's a really good question. And Spain, you know, maybe part of the answer is that the Spanish crown was not the one that had the interest in defending the mercantile route in the Pacific. Because if the Spanish crown had wanted to, they could have built up naval defenses. Instead, it was the merchants who wanted to defend the route because that's where they made money. And they, even though they had a lot of money, they would not really have had the sums necessary to sustain a naval armada in the Pacific. And what they did have was the ability to donate to the Jesuits. And if Jose de la Puente is you know, symbolic, really the Jesuits were all over the Pacific Rim. So it was something that was not difficult to do. And also the Jesuit Ignatius Loyola, he actually came from northern Spain. So it kind of sinks that way too for them.
I have a question about the Jesuits, but first I want to talk. There's a lot of comments about your use of maps and the trade routes, and I like the fact that you use Google's how long it would take to walk from the mining site. I never used the walk function, but I thought, you know, yeah, if I'm doing research on how long it would take to get, you know, silver ore laden train of pack animals, thank you, Google. But I guess I'm curious about the role of the Jesuits, and you know, I wonder how conscious they were, because you said they were, you know, well-intentioned people there to, you know, bring the natives on the Baja California from hunting and gathering into agriculture, and this is something that they thought that would improve the fortunes of the people that lived there. That sounds like they were well-intentioned, but how conscious were they, perhaps in the books that they wrote when they were doing their work, how conscious were they of the potential use of their settlements as excuses for galleons to make the trade route that they did in a way that would have allowed the Spanish mercantilists to avoid the taxes on the silver? Did they know that the fund that paid for them could have been used that way? And
my guess is the Jesuits, that the part about tax evasion was a very active knowledge that the Jesuits had, but I don't believe they wrote this down. But unfortunately, I may be forced to read like 10 books that they wrote in the 17th century in order to say that they didn't really write this down. But I don't think that they would have written that down. But I think that the Jesuits used their ability to help their donors evade taxes as a method of raising funds, which actually we still do today, right? Like we'll say, well, if you make a charitable contribution, you can have a tax deduction. So I think that the Jesuits in general at the time, you know, that was known that they might help donors evade taxes. Now, in terms of helping donors actually offload bales of cargo at Mission San Jose del Cabo and helping them spirit the silver out of Tepic and onto the galleon. Now that I am not sure that the Jesuits knew about that. And yet, so when you know, that's why I wonder, when the Santa Elvira was supposed to get to the Jesuit outpost in a month, and instead it took it 4 months. And I'm guessing that that's because they zipped down to Acapulco with a load of silver. I think that would have been a real hardship for the Jesuits, and they would not have known about that.
Sure.
But I can't believe that the missionaries at San Jose del Cabo, if bales of textiles were offloaded there, I can't believe they would not have noticed.
Right.
But it's also not entirely impossible. It could have been that a ship pulled up next to the galleon, and it, you know, it. So I don't really know if, I certainly don't think they knew. I don't think it's necessary to assume that they knew all that was going on. All that you really have to assume is that the Jesuit missionaries felt some sympathy for their donors. And I think they would feel that. They would feel like these people have really made a difference for our institution, and they're helping us to realize our dream. And so then they would maybe turn a blind eye to a few things. But I don't think that it's necessary to think that they knew the full picture of what was going on.
Sure. Yep. There's levels of complicit, but some of them are more innocent than others. And the blind eye, I think, is a good description, and a sympathetic blind eye. Let's see. I thought I saw Chris Rennick's had one. Yeah. Did the role the Jesuits play in the endeavor give them more power that allowed them to move into California?
Well, ultimately, I think the role that the Jesuits played was a mixed blessing, because they were expelled from the Spanish Empire in 1767. You know, the entire Jesuit order was expelled from the entire Spanish Empire, which was, you know, many professors, all the universities were Jesuit. Many professors of advanced age were just not only kicked out of their jobs, but kicked out of the country. The Indians in Baja California, you can say they did not do well with Jesuits, but they certainly became vulnerable when their Jesuit was expelled, because he had been someone who would advocate on their behalf in the Spanish system. So it was a real disaster in many ways. And I think, you know, after learning this story, nobody really knows why the Spanish crown expelled the Jesuits in 1767. It's not really clear. There's lots of theories. But my guess is that it does have something to do with the fact that the crown wanted to take control over the merchants, and the Jesuits were their allies. At the same time, certainly between 1697 and 1767, before the expulsion, the Jesuits were able to found mission after mission going right up the Baja California Peninsula, because they kept getting additional donations. And people at the day did think that what they were doing in Baja California was the right thing to do. You know, the population in mainland Mexico, you know, they liked what they were doing. So it was a mixed blessing. And then another interesting story would be to look at how the donors wanted to found those missions in the South, and then the Jesuits knew it was dangerous. And then when they did, they only had 25 soldiers. And so they died. So that's an interesting, you know, it's a tension, right? It goes both ways, I guess.
Sure. By the way, your description of the life of a sailor on a Spanish galleon and the weakening state over time, and how that was very poignant. Greg Knopf has a question, and he's unmuted, so I think he's able to ask it for himself.
Sure, thanks, Mike.
Sure.
Marie, I just had a question. You know, you raised the parallel of looking at the British Empire in a later period. The Spanish Empire and the British Empire in this period, I think a lot of moving parts might work independently of each other, but have common goals. So they might be slightly aware of what's going on. The Jesuits are aware of the smuggling that's going on. I wonder if the Spanish government is aware of it because it serves imperial interests. So it actually kind of makes sense to sort of close your eyes to these kinds of things. Certainly everybody in the British Empire in the late 17th century and early 18th century knew that there was all kinds of illegal trade going on. It was just a matter of when do you decide to rein that in. And my more specific question is the time frame that you're talking about is kind of fascinating to me in that context, because people are beginning to think about Baja California as an outpost, as a kind of northern outpost of New Spain, right, in the 1670s and 1680s, right? That's when people are beginning to think about this. Is there any relationship that you found between the development of that kind of thinking and the Pueblo revolt or Pope's revolution in the province of New Mexico in the 1680s, because Reconquest failed in 1681? So was there any thinking in terms of how might we reorient our northern outposts and stretch further into the Pacific?
You know, I'm actually just now doing a little project with some people on the Pueblo revolt, but up to now, that's been something that I have actually not immersed myself into. So I can't say that I do, but I think what hits me is when you ask that question is really how the 1680 Pueblo revolt also occurs at this time when there's this reorganization of the finance of silver mining and kind of a shift to the business class having a lot more autonomy and control. And I think you're completely right that, yeah, how much Spain wanted to control the business class would really depend on, yeah, I mean, certainly if the business class wanted to finance expansion into the Pacific and pay for it, why not, right? But at a certain point, the crown did feel like things had gotten away from them. So I think what I'm going to take from that is a little nudge to see if there's some connection between the Pueblo revolt and the reorganization of the silver mining.
Sure.
But I know that's not quite what you meant. But I guess I don't have the other answer.
Another question from an attendee, Susan Degidio, and she can talk now.
Michael?
There you are.
I didn't have a question. I don't know why you said
Oh,
that.
okay. Sorry.
That's okay. But while I'm unmuted,
Sure.
This was absolutely fascinating. My daughter lives in San Francisco, and I am in love with California. And just hearing you talk about all this early history is just wonderful. I really enjoyed this, but I didn't have a question.
That's okay. You're not the first person this evening to have had a hand raised by their name that actually did not have a question.
Yeah, I've done that. So
Yeah.
comment on a comment that I saw, which was about whether there were Chinese people on the galleons, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So the crew was often Filipino. And that actually is a really fascinating thing for Californians to learn, because there's so many Filipino people in California. And to really realize that they first came to California in probably, in 1571 with the galleon, and that they've been coming for so many years. I think when people hear that, it really means a lot to the Filipino community to realize that. And of course, there were people that got off galleons, but I don't know all the stories. We don't have the data. The Spanish government kept a lot of detailed records, but individual people didn't write their own stories too often. But there is, I have a colleague at Brown, and she is the head of a department on studies of race. And she's actually pioneered this whole field on the Chinese in Latin America. And I cannot understand why her name is escaping me right now, but it is. And there was a really, a substantial Chinese community in like Guadalajara, Compostela, and Tepic, and Acapulco, of course, because that's where the ships that came from Asia would go. So that's actually a new field, and one that's really interesting. And of course, it makes me wonder if any of the Filipino sailors actually got off in California, in like 1693. And I suspect that some probably did, because the galleon did trade with the Chumash in the Santa Barbara Channel. And it just seems like in 250 years of voyages, you know, for the same reason that there were sailors in the tip of Baja California who blended in with the indigenous community, I would imagine that that happened in other places too. But no proof.
Okay. There's a comment from Joanna Andros that I'm not sure you can see, Marie, in the chat. And there's one question that is in the Q&A from an old student that I haven't spoken or communicated with in a while, Ivan Stave. Ivan.
Amazing.
Yeah. So his question is, was the galleon ever incorporated, kind of like a modern day corporation? Also, what kind of internal control systems did the Spanish crown have, I assume, over the galleons at the time? Control, detection, etc. So I'll let you have at that, Marie.
So Ivan, you probably don't know this, but I still have your project in the binder in the basement from when you did it. I was just looking at it. He was in a class where we interviewed local businessmen and presented at the Hannah Grimes Center. It was our first time and it was really scary and it was great. And the Spanish crown, its control systems on the galleon. Well, the business community didn't have corporations, but they belonged to a corporation, which was called the Consulado de Mexico. And that was like kind of a Congress for business people. It was a political body where they made business decisions. And there were two great rivalries in there, the Cantabrians and the Basques. So every single businessman in Mexico at that time period was either Cantabrian or Basque. And they actually had the right to collect taxes in Mexico City, and they paid the crown 228,000 pesos per year, and they kept the rest. So they wound up with this very large fund, and people have suggested, or Guillermin del Valle Pavon in Mexico City suggested that they use that fund to finance the expansion of silver mining. So there was this body, and to some extent that did put some control on things, and it also gave the crown a way to negotiate with them. And in terms of in terms of checks on the galleon, like, yes, like Pedro Gil de la Sierpe was the treasurer at Acapulco, and he was supposed to collect taxes, which meant he would count the cargo and everything. But since it appears that he was in cahoots with the Luis Sanchez de Tagle silver bank, he just did it. So the crown had all kinds of rules for making sure that people paid taxes. It just that many of the bureaucrats who were enforced with collecting the taxes were part of the business community, and their loyalties were more to their family's business than it was to the crown. Although, so none of those checks and balances worked. And so a lot of historians have actually written about all these checks and balances, and that actually turns out not to be terribly useful because they weren't enforced. But like I said, when there was a crisis, the business community donated to the crown through its consulado. Well, so, people, I think you might be getting tired. Do you think they're getting tired, Mike?
I think that we are at the wrap-up time. And I do know there's some still unanswered question or two, and maybe a comment that I haven't relayed. And I'm sorry, and I will make sure that Marie sees and hears them. And I will hope that maybe people can get in touch with Professor Duggan. I know she's available. Her contact is mduggan@keene.edu, and she'd be happy to answer questions. And with that, I will thank Marie one more time for a wonderful talk, and look to see most of you and students for sure next week. And so thank you, Marie, and good night, the rest of you.